Morning, everybody. I want to begin the lesson today by just letting you know how much I truly love you all and truly appreciate you. You guys know that the next few weeks are going to be especially painful and sad for me, and so many of you have already gone out of your way to be encouraging and to let me know that you're praying for me. It means a great deal. And of course, we have other members here who've had to walk down this same road. Tommy and Paul are about to come upon some anniversaries from the passing of their wives. And so we have a lot of people to be thinking of and to be praying for. But I just want you to know how much it means to me. And I also want you to know that just like Paul and Tommy can tell you, as sad as these kinds of anniversaries are, when you've had a very happy marriage, there are also happy memories that flash into your mind. And that is the case with me and my relationship with Christy. When Christy and I started dating, one of the first dates we went on, she actually treated me to a documentary at a beautiful little theater in Nashville, a documentary about one of my favorite pursuits that reflects the sophisticated intellectual that I am. It was a documentary about professional wrestling that she took me to. When I was a kid, wrestling was very regional, and the wrestling that I grew up watching was based out of Memphis, Tennessee, and this was the documentary about Memphis wrestling. And so just imagine the bizarro world my poor wife thought she had tumbled into to take me to this. But it really kind of came full circle because a year ago, when we went up to Nashville, while I was there, I actually had made friends through Twitter with the guy who was the promoter for the wrestling that I grew up on, whose name was Jerry Jarrett. And one night while Christy and I were up in Nashville, I said, I almost want to just reach out to him and see if he'd like to go grab lunch. And she said, well, you should do it. So I did, and immediately he said, here, give me a call. And he gave me his number. So the last time Christy and I actually went out to eat, we went out to eat with my Twitter friend and one of my childhood heroes, Jerry Jarrett, and I've talked with him since then, and it's just kind of a cherished memory, that we got to do that together. Anyway, my favorite wrestler growing up, he's now a commentator, was a guy named Jerry the King Lawler, and he was a great good guy and bad guy, but I really liked him when he was a bad guy. And I remember watching one time, and I found this clip on YouTube where he's trash talking about his opponent and how bad he is and what he's going to do to him. And when he got done with all of his threats, he said, and that's the gospel, baby. Well, what did he mean when he said that's the gospel? Well, what he meant is that's the truth that you can absolutely count on. And in fact, we have an expression even in our culture, the gospel truth. That is the gospel truth. And it comes from a belief that was once widely shared in our culture that the gospels are a reliable truth that you can count on. But obviously times have changed. I don't think I've ever heard anybody use that expression in our culture recently because that belief is no longer widely shared. And it is the reliability of the Gospels that I want to talk with you about this morning. Now, in the last couple of weeks, I have done my best to make a case for the existence of God, in part by dealing with some of the objections and doubts that people have about the existence of God, but also by providing reasons to believe that God exists. But to be honest, so far, all that I have said, if one of my Jewish friends or Muslim friends had been in the audience, they would have no problem accepting what I have said because they also believe that there is one God. In fact, even some of my Hindu friends would really basically agree that there must ultimately be one source of all reality. So why then do I believe in Christianity in particular? Well, it turns out that one of the things that separates Christianity from other religions is that Christianity actually offers its own stake, its own criteria for whether it should be accepted. Unlike Islam and unlike Hinduism, Christianity says there is something we believe happened in history that is so remarkable and so compelling, it should draw you to faith in Jesus Christ. And that is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So what I want to spend time with you on today is talking about why we should believe that case and why I do believe that that case is so compelling. But I want to basically this morning just do the best I can to dissolve some of the objections that people sometimes have for trusting in the reliability of the Gospels. And I want to begin with an objection that I hear a lot. And that objection is that you cannot trust the Gospels because the Gospels are biased. So here, for example, is a quotation from, and maybe just pause, I have no control over what's going on up here. So who's running the show today and has the clicker? Raise your hand and let me know where you are. Okay, John Haley has torn up this thing. Well, here's the thing. I can't run this sermon today if I can't show you these slides. So it's either going to be a really short sermon or our crack team. All right. Yeah. I'm going to push your button right here in front of everybody. I've been pushing this button for 5 minutes, and you just pushed my button. But we're all one big spiritual family here, guys. We do have some, yeah, that's right. I'm about to bring out my pro wrestling persona here. As you all know, we've got a problem right now because our system lags, and you all see it happen sometimes in the songs. Quite honestly, part of this is because you guys are logging on to all of your smart devices and slowing our system down. And I know that after 5 minutes, you're ready to check out. But it would help if you would just hang in there and not log on to these. All right, so I'm going to try this. There we go. All right, now we're back to our regularly scheduled programming. So here's a typical example of the claim of bias. This is from a book I've mentioned to you before by a guy who used to be a Pentecostal preacher who says the gospel stories are no more historic than the Genesis accounts are scientific. They are filled with exaggerations, miracles, and admitted propaganda. How can you accept us to take the Gospels as reliable history when obviously the writers of the Gospel had a point of view? Well, there is some truth to this. The writers of the Gospel clearly did have a point of view, but guess what? Everybody who writes history has a point of view. I mean, literally, just in the act of selecting which events from a person's life you want to talk about, it's itself a tremendous point of view because those are the things that you think are really important. So it does not disqualify the Gospels as reliable history merely to assert that because the Gospel writers say things like Zach read for us just a moment ago, where John says at the end of his Gospel, many other signs Jesus performed in the presence of the disciples, but these have been written that you might believe. The fact that he has an agenda doesn't make him different than any other person who has written history who also has a point of view. The issue here is, does having a point of view automatically disqualify the Gospels as legitimate history? One of the most compelling books ever written about the Holocaust is a book called Night by a Jewish author named Elie Wiesel. Now, is the fact that he was Jewish somehow disqualifying that when he writes about the Holocaust, that what he says is unreliable since he clearly has a point of view as someone who is Jewish, and not only that, as someone who is actually in those prison camps? Well, it might, but it doesn't automatically mean that what he wrote is illegitimate. It just would mean that sometimes we need to give some very careful scrutiny. So what I would say to you this morning is, yes, of course, the Gospels have a point of view. But there is one kind of detail the Gospels include that I think show us that while they have a point of view, they do intend to give us an accurate accounting of what happened. And that is, the Gospels are painfully honest. Now, what do I mean by that? Suppose that I wrote an autobiography. Suppose I wrote an account of my life. Now, do you imagine that I might have a point of view? And that there could be the possibility of bias if I wrote the story of my own life? Well, yes, of course, that is possible. But if I, for example, in the course of this autobiography told you that I failed my first driver's test, which I did, because the guy said I didn't turn my blinker on early enough. And if you grew up in my hometown, if you used it at all, that separated you from everybody else. But he said, you didn't turn it on early enough. So I failed my driver's test. Right? So if I included that kind of self-damaging information, it would make you think, well, okay, if he's willing to tell us even the embarrassing things, then that gives us an indication to think that he's going to just tell us what actually happened. I want you to consider that the Gospels contain a lot of information that from a certain point of view would be embarrassing. I'm just going to flip through the opening chapters of the Gospel of Mark to point out some of these features that I would ask you to consider. For example, in Mark chapter 1, if I ask you, who was John the Baptist baptizing and why, you would say that it was people he was calling to repentance. And in fact, in Mark chapter 1 and verse 4, it even says that his baptism was a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And yet, guess who John baptizes? He baptizes Jesus. Now, do you understand why that would have presented some at least cause for pause and reflection? Wait a minute, if Jesus is the sinless Son of God, why is he being baptized by John? In fact, even John says, wait a minute, I'm the one that ought to be baptized by you and not vice versa. It's just a curious detail. Or how about this detail? In John chapter 3 and verse 21, Jesus' own family believes he is crazy. The inclusion of that detail to show us that even those closest to Jesus in his family lineage thought he was crazy gives us some indication that the Gospels are telling us truths that no matter how awkward, they just intend to convey. Here's another one. In Mark chapter 6 and verse 5, the text says that when Jesus went to Nazareth, quote, he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid hands on a few sick people and healed them. Do you see how that would be, from a certain point of view, a very embarrassing detail? Wait a minute, you mean Jesus couldn't do a miracle somewhere? Now, all of these details are details the Gospels have a reason to give to us. But what I want you to see is, at the very minimum, these were details that to the early readers of the Gospel would have been certainly awkward, and yet the Gospels just give them to us. How about this? In contrast to certain Jewish stories found outside of the Bible about heroic martyrs welcoming death, what does Mark tell us about Jesus in the garden in Mark chapter 14? He was in agony. He was distressed, and he begged God to let the cup pass from him. Or his cry of dereliction on the cross when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? All of these raised questions about, well, wait a minute, if Jesus is the Son of God, why would he pray like that? There are reasons for all of these passages. I just want you to see that they are passages that are awkward, but nonetheless included, because it gives us reason to think the gospel writers were interested in telling us what happened, as embarrassing or self-damaging as some of these details may be. And maybe the one detail most of all that probably because we are Christians, we don't grasp how self-damaging this was. Jesus was crucified. Now, of course, you and I as Christians, we relish the fact that Jesus died on the cross to take away our sins. We're sad that it happened, but we're so joyful that God gave his son to die for us like this. But do you realize, of course, that in the first century, death by crucifixion was the most demeaning, humiliating death of all? And when early people in the first century, pagans and Jews, heard the claim that the Son of God came and died on the cross, they thought it was absurd that anyone would ever think that's the Son of God. Here's some graffiti that has been found in Rome. You probably can't make out the actual relief very well on the left-hand side, so here's a rendition of it on the right. But it shows a man on the cross with the head of a donkey. And the graffiti says, Alexamenos worships his God. The claim that God would come as a man and be killed on the cross by crucifixion was absurd to a lot of people in the first century. And yet the Gospels focus on the story of the crucifixion itself. My point is that, yes, the Gospels have a point of view, but that point of view does not preclude them from honestly including details that raised questions, but they were willing to raise those questions because they were concerned to tell the truth. Well, but somebody says, wait a minute. You want me to accept the Jesus in the Gospels? That's right. And you're going to use the Gospels to make that case? Yes. Well, then you're assuming what you're trying to prove, that we should rely on the Gospels. In fact, last Sunday night, I made a huge mistake. I actually sat down at my computer to write up my chapel talk that I was going to give the next day at Florida College. But instead, I checked Twitter first. And I was sucked into a black hole of atheist Twitter. And for about an hour, it was kind of like one of those movies where there's somebody who's having to fight like 25 people coming at him from all directions. It was crazy. I mean, as fast as I could type the answer one, somebody else jumped in. It's kind of like one of those old-time wrestling shows. All right, so this is what happened. As I was on Twitter, somebody said this. The Bible is the claim. It's not its own evidence. Without substantiation via evidence from other independent sources, it's not reasonable to accept the veracity of these extraordinary claims of Jesus. Now, there is sort of a grain of truth to this objection. I mean, think about it. If I were arguing like this, Jesus is the Son of God, why do you think that? The Gospels say so. Why do you believe them? Because Jesus gave the Gospels and he's the Son of God. Well, why do you believe that? Because the Gospels say so. Why do you believe? Well, you see, that would be circular reasoning. But that is not the reasoning here at all. I'm not asking anyone to take the Gospels here initially as infallible Scripture. The case that I want to make is much more modest than that. The case is simply this, that the Gospels give us reliable history. I do believe that the Gospels are inspired Scripture. But I'm not asking anyone who is an unbeliever to just assume that that is the case. But I do ask them to consider that the Gospels are ancient documents that make historical claims that ought to be evaluated as such. And that's what the Gospels say. Look with me, for example, in Luke chapter 1, at the way his Gospel begins. Luke chapter 1. Here's what Luke tells us. Luke chapter 1, verse 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you've been taught. What Luke is saying is, what I am presenting to you is a historical investigation. I know others have made claims, so I've done some research. I've investigated sources, and that's what he says he wants Theophilus to consider. And that's what I'm asking people to consider. I'm not saying that you have to believe the Gospels are absolutely infallible. I'm just asking you to consider, do they contain some reliable historical information? Let me give you an example. You've heard me before talk about my roots in eastern Kentucky and the fact that the Scott family is related to the McCoys of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. And you also have heard me talk about the fact that my brother Dean Franklin over here is related to the godless, bloodthirsty, murdering Hatfield clan. And I say that with total impartiality. And the fact that we're such good friends is just a hallmark of the Nobel Peace Prize that we both should get. Well, anyway, a few years ago, I got this book, and it's about the McCoys. And it contains a lot of information about the McCoys. And in the back, there is a genealogy. And here's the section of the genealogy that goes through the Scott family that's intermarried with the McCoys. And it has my great-great-granddad, my great-great-great-granddad, but when it lists my great-great-granddad, there is a name missing in the genealogy. It's the name of my great-granddad. He's not in here. Now, does that mean that because this book made one slight error, that it does not give reliable history? Does it mean that my great-granddad never existed? Well, that's right. Because if he didn't exist, then Pop didn't exist, and then Mom didn't exist, woo, I'm gone. Well, no, that's not what's going on here. This book contained reliable history. I don't have to ask you to accept it as the infallible Word of God to say, hey, there's some reliable history here. And my point is not that I don't believe in a high view of the Gospels. That's not the point at all. My point is that for the sake of argument, when talking with someone who is not a believer, all I want you to really consider is it possible that these Gospels contain what they assert, which is they have reliable historical information? Well, what would make it reliable? Well, one thing that would make it reliable is eyewitness testimony. That's exactly what Luke says here. He has investigated eyewitness accounts. If you'd go over with me to chapter 8, Luke 8 contains a lot of examples of the sort of eyewitness testimony he could investigate. For example, Luke 8 and verse 1 mentions that Jesus was accompanied by the 12. And we know from the book of Acts that Luke would have had opportunity on trips to Jerusalem to have interviewed some of the apostles. He could have gotten their eyewitness testimony. Not only that, but do you see in Luke chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, there is an entire list of women who followed Jesus? Luke would have had opportunity to interview some of these women who were eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry. If you drop down to Luke 8, verses 19 and 20, it mentions Jesus' family, which we know from the book of Acts eventually became believers and lived in the city of Jerusalem, and Luke could have had opportunity on one of his trips there to interview them. Or how about if you just scan through the rest of chapter 8, where Jesus heals a man with a demon, or Jesus heals a man whose daughter died, heals the daughter of a man who died, and also a woman who had a bleeding disease. Think of all of the people Jesus healed or otherwise did miracles for that Luke may have had the opportunity to interview and to draw information from. The point is, the Gospels are based on multiple lines of eyewitness testimony, and we don't have to assume the Gospels are inspired to just simply say, look, here we have some historical information, and we can draw some conclusions about what this historical claim suggests. But somebody says, no, wait a minute. You're assuming that the Gospels were written close enough to the time of Jesus that there could be reliable information. That's not true. One of my Facebook friends one time said this: in my opinion, the New Testament is the longest game of telephone ever played. I don't think a rational person can truly believe the events of the New Testament are 100% accurate. They were written hundreds of years after the crucifixion. Well, let's tackle these points here. First of all, is it true that the Gospels are the longest example of the telephone game ever played? We all know what the telephone game is, right? I start over here with Alan, whisper something to him, he whispers, and then it comes out over here to Jackson, and almost always it's something ridiculously far and different from the original, right? So here's what my friend was saying is, these stories about Jesus were passed down over hundreds of years, and there's no way that you could really tell if they were accurate because it's just like a telephone game. Well, no, not really. Here's some reasons why. Number one, the telephone game, by its very nature, is set up to fail. Why is it set up to fail? Well, first of all, is the information passed publicly or privately? I mean, it's literally whispered. Is that how the information about Jesus was passed down? Did everybody go around whispering? No, not at all. In fact, at one point they say, look, these things haven't been done in a corner. Everybody knows about these things that are taking place. Secondly, was there only one line of eyewitness testimony? No, of course not. We just talked about there are many lines of eyewitness testimony coming down simultaneously. Third, in the telephone game, there's nobody to kind of check. I mean, that's the whole point, right? You have to wait till you get to the very end. Whereas in the time of the first century, as the stories of Jesus were passed down, were there people around who could say, hey, wait a minute, that's not right? Yeah, the apostles. As a matter of fact, we're studying 1 John in the college class. This is one of the things John keeps talking about is, hey, these people have gone out from us, and what they're saying about Jesus is not true. I just want you to see that the way the eyewitness testimony of Jesus was passed down was nothing at all like the telephone game. And then here is the other thing. My friend here says, that the Gospels were written hundreds of years after the crucifixion. That is not true at all. The Gospels are based on multiple lines of eyewitness testimony written in living memory of Jesus. Here is a chart I copied and pasted out of a book about the Gospels, which contains dates for the Gospels from 3 sources, 2 Jewish sources and 1 skeptical source. And you see that none of these date the Gospels really past the 1st century except possibly for the Gospel of John. All of the Gospels were written well within the living memory of the time of Jesus. It just isn't true that there was one line of information about Jesus whispered about like the telephone game that was only written down hundreds of years later. As a matter of fact, one study of ancient history says that from the point of view of ancient historians, kind of like Goldilocks, it's just right. There was a time to write down history that was just right. And what ancient historians said is if you do it too soon, your emotions might get involved. If you do it too late, there is time for information that's wrong to creep in. So what they thought the ideal was for a time within the living memory of the person you're writing about, but not precisely at the same time. As one student of this says, the ideal setting for historical writing is distant enough to avoid nearsightedness, myopia, yet within the period of living memory. And as you can see from these dates for the Gospels are exactly in this just right time frame to have been written down as reliable history. But somebody says, well, wait a minute. Who even wrote these Gospels? We don't know who wrote them. Richard Dawkins says, nobody knows who the 4 evangelists were, but they almost certainly never met Jesus personally. Much of what they wrote was in no sense an honest attempt at history. Now, there's a lot to say about this, but I just want to offer you some basic common sense observations about the authorship of the Gospels. First of all, if it is the case that nobody really knows who wrote the Gospels, and the early Christians just made up the names, consider why among the names they just made up were the names of Mark and Luke. Were Mark and Luke a part of the 12? No. Do they even figure significantly in the Gospels? Obviously not. In the case of Luke, he's not even one of the people who would have been an original follower of Jesus. If you were going to just make up the names, which is what the claim is, why would you have made them up? And here is the second thing. How is it possible that the early Christians all over the empire just happened to pick out these 4 names as the names of the gospel authors? And it just so happens that everywhere we know of where the early Christians talked about the first gospel, they said Matthew wrote it. And everywhere they talk about the second writer, they say Mark wrote it. And every time they talk about the third gospel, they say Luke wrote it. And every time they talk about the 4th, they say John wrote it. What are the chances that the early Christians around the world all just happened to come up with the same 4 names to identify with the same 4 Gospels? In fact, I was trying to think about how to calculate the odds of that. So I multiplied 1 out of 4 times 1 out of 4 times 1 out of 4, and then I remembered I'm horrible at math. But, I think one of you could probably do that. And the point would be, it is astronomical to imagine they just all happen to come up with these same names. The reality is the early and unanimous testimony of history is that these Gospels were written by the traditional authors, all of whom lived within living history of Jesus, 2 of whom were actually disciples. Here's just an example of this information. There's a writer named Irenaeus who in the 2nd century is dealing with heretics. And he talks about the origin of the Gospels. And he says, Matthew issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also laid down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. And afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence in Asia and Ephesus. The point I want you to see is that all of the evidence points to the traditional authorship of the Gospels, and it would seem absurd to imagine the early Christians all happened to invent the same names. Well, but somebody says, doesn't make any difference. As Bart Ehrman, who used to be a believer, who left the faith, said, the Gospels hopelessly contradict each other. Now, part of the issue here when people think that there are contradictions that undermine the reliability of the Gospels is that they are holding the Gospels to certain standards of accuracy that were just not the standards of ancient history. Here's what I'm talking about. I just bought an Apple Watch last week, and then I realized I'm never going to figure this out. So I just returned it last week here. I'm sorry for all of my Apple aficionados there. But, you know, one of the cool things about that watch is it would tell you the exact time, and you didn't have to set it. The satellite would always set it. So all last week, I was still late, but I knew exactly how late I was every day. So that was pretty cool. But, you know, we can talk about exact time because of technology. That's technology they did not have in the first century. So when they talked about time, all they could do is estimate. So in the Gospel of Mark, Mark says the crucifixion took place at 9 o'clock in the morning. In John's Gospel, he says it took place about noon. Is that some great contradiction? Well, think about it like this. Last week, one night, I can't remember what night it was. I think it was Tuesday night. I had a hard time getting to sleep. Just could not fall asleep. And I think I fell asleep at 3 o'clock. Now, here's the poll that I want to take. How many of you would have said, if you fell asleep, you fell asleep very late at night? Raise your hands, please. Very late at night. How many of you would say you fell asleep very early in the morning? You all are the morning people, aren't you? Those other people that raise their, we don't like you, just as a general rule, right? Yeah. Well, wait a minute. Which was it? Late at night or early in the morning? Well, do you see, even with our modern technology that can nail down a precise time, when you're going to approximate things differently, but we all know what is meant. And so many of the contradictions, so-called, in the Gospels simply fall under this basic problem here of it's just not how they did history in the ancient world. It could be reliable, but still be summarized. I'll give you another quick example. Look with me over in John chapter 20. John chapter 20. In Matthew's Gospel, Matthew says in Matthew 28 and verse 1 that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb and saw that it was empty. But in John's account, in John 20 and verse 1, he only mentions one woman. Do you see that? Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. Now, is there a contradiction here? Matthew says 2 women went. John says 1 woman went. Well, do you understand that when you're writing history, even today, and certainly in the ancient world, you could summarize or abbreviate or be selective in the details that you choose to talk about and not be a contradiction? As a matter of fact, it's pretty clear that John was intentionally selecting 1 woman, knowing there were others there, because do you see in verse 2 what it says? So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where he is. We. Well, I thought it was only 1 woman. Well, yeah, John chose to talk about one of the women there, but it's even implicit here that there were more there in John chapter 20 and verse 2. And so many of the so-called contradictions don't take into account just basic writing of history, and certainly the way history was written in the time frame in which the Gospels were given. But somebody says, well, wait a minute. these aren't the only Gospels. Did any of y'all actually go see the Da Vinci Code or read it? Just kind of curious. This was the big thing, 13 years ago. Okay. So the Da Vinci Code is like your classic conspiracy theory book, except it's about the Gospels. And one of the key characters in the book says that there were actually more than 80 Gospels considered for the New Testament, and yet only relatively few were chosen for inclusion, for the Net Testament. That was my secretary's fault here. No, that was my fault. The New Testament. Only more than 80 were considered for the New Testament, but only 4 were chosen. Well, that's not true. There are a handful of other books that call themselves Gospels. But there is a reason these alternate Gospels were rejected. And it is because the early Christians believed, first of all, these were written too late to be considered authentic. And even more fundamentally, those alleged other Gospels are so far removed and disjointed from the storyline of the Bible, they could not be legitimate. And the best way to illustrate this is just to read them. Now, you know how the 4 Gospels start. All 4 Gospels in the Bible, in their own way, hook in immediately to the story of the Old Testament, right? Matthew 1:1, the genealogy of Jesus, son of David, son of Abraham. Mark opens with a prophecy from Isaiah. Luke opens up with those same prophecies as he talks about the early ministry of John. John starts off in the beginning, connecting us to the Old Testament. Here is how one of these other Gospels begins. This is the Gospel, not begins, but here's what it says. This is the Gospel of Judas. Judas said to Jesus, I know who you are and where you've come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbelo. Now, are you sitting there thinking, what in the world is Barbelo? You and all the other early Christians. That's obviously not anything found in the Old Testament. In fact, where that term comes from is from certain Greek philosophical ideas called Gnosticism, in which they believed that there was God, but then there were these other beings that radiated out from God, and one of them is Barbelo. And obviously, when the early Christians would have read something like this, they would think, wait a minute. This has nothing to do with the story of the Gospels, which are so anchored in the Old Testament. It reminds me of a scene from The Office where Jim is trying to get Dwight to talk to distract him from work. And so he starts to talk about Dwight's favorite TV show, which is Battlestar Galactica. And he says to another guy whose name was Andy, hey, have you ever seen this show called Battlestar Galactica? And he goes, no, tell me about it. He goes, oh, it's a story about a guy named Dumbledore Calrissian who has to return a ring to Mordor. And Andy goes, that doesn't sound right. That's my favorite line. It's so understated. It doesn't sound. Well, if you're not hip, then you don't understand. He just mixed up a bunch of elements that have nothing to do with each other. And that's why the early Christians said, these are not legit Gospels. When you start talking about Jesus coming from Barbelo, you're introducing a storyline here that's totally foreign to the Old Testament itself. And so the reason the early Christians did not accept these is because they were so garbled that they were obviously illegitimate and not genuine Gospels. So what I want to just simply say is that we have good reason to think that the Gospels give us enough reliable historical information based on eyewitness testimony that we can make some judgments about the claims of Jesus. Now, that's not exactly a news flash. Like, nobody in here was thinking, I bet at the end of the sermon he's going to say, we can't trust the Gospels at all. I mean, I'm pretty sure everybody realized that's where we were going here. I mean, we're all Christians. We've gathered on the Lord's Day. We've just worshiped Jesus. But I would say to all of us this morning that there is another sort of testimony that needs to be reliable. One of the things that somebody said, I think that quote from Twitter, there's no outside corroboration of the gospel. It was just simply not true. There are sources in Roman writings and Jewish writings that mention Jesus brothers, mention that he was crucified, and the claim that he rose from the dead. But one of the ones that is so compelling to me is a letter by a governor whose name was Pliny the Younger, and he's writing to the emperor, Trajan, to explain, here's how I'm having to deal with all these so-called Christians. He says, I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question a second and a third time, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be led off to crucifixion. There were people in the first century who had to make a decision as to whether they would remain loyal to Jesus or cave in to some other lord. It's the same choice that faces all of us. The gods may be slightly different, but whether it is the god of materialism or the god of hedonism, of just wanton sexual pleasure, or the god of nationalism, there are all kinds of gods in our world that are vying for our loyalty to Jesus Christ. He says, those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, who repeated after me an invocation to the gods and offered adoration with wine and incense to your statue, which I'd ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with the images of the gods, and who finally cursed Christ, all things that is said that no real Christian can be forced to do. If they would just cave in and worship another god, he says, I would dismiss the charges. And then he says, when they tried to tell me what they were about as Christians, he says, they affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, and of singing in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and binding themselves by a solemn oath not to wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word or deny a pledge when they were called upon to deliver it up. In other words, the way they lived was the real testimony to where they believed the truth of the Gospels. And that is going to be the same for us. I mean, I've talked with enough people to know that there are people with genuine intellectual questions about the truthfulness of the Gospels. I've tried to tackle some of those, many questions in a short time today. But I also know that there are people who just want to know, are there people who claim to believe these things who actually mean it, who are authentic, whose lives give authentic testimony to the truth of the Gospels? And I will say to you that if we commit ourselves to this authentic life as Christians, there are a lot of people we can reach because they are searching for something that is real and for people who take it real. And that's the invitation for all of us as children of God this morning, to live like we mean it. And for those of you not Christians, we would love for you to respond to the message of the gospel. You know, the sad thing is, I just only have so much time, and I've tried to talk with you about why the message of the gospel is reliable, but I haven't had time to say much about the message itself. And here is the message. The God that we studied about the last couple of weeks, the God who is the eternal, unique, immaterial, unchanging, perfect source of all existence, so far above us, Isaiah says there's no way to compare him to anything. That God, so high, so far, so above us, loves us so much that he came down and entered into our story and took upon himself humanity and died and rose again to make an offer to you that while you have blown it in your relationship with God, he has come to pave a way for all of us to have a relationship with God if we will just hang on to him. And in our faith and baptism, that is exactly what we are doing, uniting ourselves with him. And that's the message we urge you to consider while we stand and sing together.